Hello, everyone. I'm the director for our New Zealand not-for-profit charitable educational trust called Common Knowledge. And I'm doing this series on you and childbirth. And today I want to talk about birth providers or birth professionals or birth workers, however you want to call them. And I'm going to talk to you about this in general and how you fit into this. And then I'll do more in this series, specifically on midwives and specifically on obstetricians and labor and delivery nurses and every group, because you as an individual are dealing with your coming birth. And it's an issue. Everything is an issue. What do you want? What do you not want? How do you envision your birth? What do you hope your birth is going to be like? Where you're going to birth? Who's going to be there? And particularly with COVID, a lot of things have changed. And it's really important for you to understand how you fit into this. This is your baby's birth. And all of these factors influence what happens. They touch you. And so you need to understand them. So just let me tell you a little bit about myself. I gave birth in 1970 in the United States when we had no choices, and 99.9% of us went to the hospital, and there were standards of care assessments, monitoring procedures. There was the evidence-based practice of the day. The last time I gave birth in 1982, the evidence-based practice had changed in the United States, and women now had more choices. And things have since changed. And I moved to New Zealand in the 90s, and New Zealand had put in a midwifery model of care. And so 98% of midwives have a continuity of care midwife and partnership. And that system is not working very well either on a pragmatic basis. But we'll talk about it another day. I was very fortunate in the early 70s to accidentally start working with hundreds of families who developed the birthing better skills. When I gave birth in 1970, the very first childbirth preparation courses were being taught, Lamaze and Bradley. They were entirely skills-based. However, as I've mentioned in other videos, those three obstetricians, Grantley, Dick Reed, and New Zealand, focused on low-risk women who they assumed would have a low-risk birth. And they believed that if those women learned their skills, they would have a natural birth, a pain-free labor, with no medical interventions. That didn't pan out after a generation. So the next group of natural birth advocates in the 70s started to say skills aren't essential. Cows and cats aren't taught to birth. Women don't need to birth. And you just need to make choices. Grantley, Dick Reed, and Bradley and Lamaze, even though they were obstetrician, started this anti-medical approach. The medical profession, in reality, this is the modern medical profession, didn't get really sophisticated in maternity care until my lifetime. So when I gave birth in 1970, a cesarean was done to save a woman's life, and it was major abdominal surgery, and the rest of us, risks or not, labored and had a vaginal birth because there wasn't anything that they could really do. And the medical profession responds to how we as consumers in modern cultures want them to respond. So we as modern people see ourselves as different from traditional people because we have advantages. And those advantages are as simple as indoor plumbing, refrigeration, or schooling, or health and safety, modern medicine. Things like immunizations have gone around the world, but they didn't at first. Things like antibiotics have gone around the world, but they didn't at first. Those were things that privileged modern people had access to, that the rest of the world didn't have access to. So we saw ourselves as different from how we were prior to being modern people. We expected to be socially mobile, upward and horizontally. And so we have an expectation that the modern medical profession reduces or prevents risks in all of our health. Or why would people be taking so much statin drugs, or dealing with diabetes or heart problems? And maternity care is no different. When I gave birth, breech, twins, Rh negative, placenta prevas, All of these things were just considered to be risks, were a normal part of this natural, normal, and physiological part of women's life. There was no birth control. There was no safe and legal abortion. And we followed our doctor's orders, and we did it gladly because our parents' generation or our grandparents' generation didn't have access to that kind of care. So even in New Zealand, in the turn of the 20th century, 1920, it had the second highest maternal mortality rate due to childbirth sepsis because germ theory hadn't really been developed. Washing hands, being clean wasn't understood. So many of the assessments, monitoring procedures that were done to us or around us were done to try to safeguard our lives and our well-being and our babies' lives and well-being. Didn't always like those things, but that's the reason they were done. They didn't do them randomly, and they didn't do them in order to get women. So what is a birth provider or birth professional? Well, in many countries, it's an obstetrician, but the obstetrical profession is quite recent. In the United States, it was in the 1950s that it was formed as a specialty. New Zealand, it was formed a little bit earlier. It was usually general practitioners, just a doctor, a family doctor who delivered a baby, or a midwife. Midwives were either trained or not. They were either nurses or not. They either worked in the system or outside the system, or they attended at hospital births and home births, or in hospital only and not at home births. And so we have three birth professionals nowadays. In the United States, midwifery was outlawed in 1958 or something like that. Now each state, 50 states, has to determine, do we want to have a midwife? Should the midwife be direct entry trained like they are in New Zealand or they are in other countries? Or should they be nurses first? And, what can they do? Can they do home births or only hospital births? And so then there are also auxiliary people who help, the doulas, the childbirth educators, the therapists, and stuff like that. General practitioners, how were they differentiated from obstetricians? Well, it was surgeons who did cesareans, not general practitioners, and obstetricians then became the ones who were doing cesareans. So you need to understand when you're working with a birth professional that they are, by and large, most likely to be a member of a professional organization and to be trained through a professional body, which means they have standards of practice. Those are the things that they're obligated to do, whether you like them or not. Midwives will have obligations. They won't have the sophistication of training that a general practitioner will have or a obstetrician will have. If they're a direct entry trained midwife, they won't have much exposure to concomitant or comorbid issues. So, for instance, in New Zealand, I can remember a midwife saying to me, I had a woman who had an asthma attack in labor and she didn't know what to do about it because she hadn't been trained as a nurse to understand how to respond to asthma. So she was just a midwife dealing with pregnancy and childbirth as though this was a separate thing of life. So midwives, obstetricians, general practice physicians all have standards of practice. That's what they're obligated to do. And if they don't follow those things, then they fall outside the guidelines of practice. Although I have to tell you, in the medical profession, the most common reason that people lose their license is that they've had sexual relationships with their clients, and doesn't have to do with malfeasance. In fact, iatrogenic, medically induced problems weren't counted until very, very recently. And another factor in the United States is that nobody has sued an obstetrician for performing an unnecessary cesarean, but a lot of them have been sued for not doing a cesarean soon enough. So you need to understand that when you're dealing with an obstetrician or a doctor or a midwife, they have standards of practice. You just have to deal with those things, and you need to talk about them. And those auxiliary people, often they do not have professional organizations that they're dealing with. Sometimes they do. And you need to understand where their limits are. And then there's the place where you birth, which is more likely to be a hospital, a maternity home, birth center. And they too have guidelines to practice, which may differ from the practitioners. And those are the ones that tend to get followed. A practitioner might say, oh, yeah, you can. And then they have to practice within that physical space. In the physical space, the rules and regulations go, no, you can't. And then you have an issue. Home birth's a bit different because there aren't any guidelines, particularly to practice to delivering, having your baby at home. And that's always become problematic, even in the United States in the 70s. Home birth was really considered to be an ideological statement, an anti-medical statement, which meant it was quite difficult to move into a hospital environment, and many people stayed at home for ideological reasons. And that often caused problems because they lacked the skills to reduce or prevent their own suffering, and they lacked the skills to reduce or prevent their births from becoming more problematic, such as a long first or second stage. And so in the 70s, when home births started to become very prevalent, there were a lot of problems at home births that people don't want to talk about. Because if they talk about problems at home births, then they're afraid that the system is going to say you can't birth at home. We understand that. The same way that I was involved in 5 different states, the discussions about how midwives should be organized. And they would sit down and say, these are the guidelines that we believe we should follow. But when you ask them, are you following those guidelines now? They'd say no. And so, but they were all lying on their notes. And that becomes a problem because then you really don't know what's happening. So in your pregnancy, you're dealing with 2 things: care providers. And those care providers can be continuity care or not continuity care. And you're going to go to a place where you're going to have your baby, or you're going to be at home. So you are being told, and have been told since the 1980s, that you are in charge of your birth, that you know what kind of birth you want, and that you should articulate what you want in a birth plan. We'll call that a conventional birth plan. So you present your birth plan, which may have one thing: I want to have a safe and healthy birth, or it may have 50 things. I want low music, I want to bring my own food, I want my mother and somebody else there. I want to be able to walk around, I want to get in the water, I want to be the first one to touch my baby, I don't want vitamin K, I want the cord to not be cut. If I need a problem, I want to be talked about, I'm going to say no to this, this, and this. And when we create these big birth plans, nobody honestly knows what we want. And frankly, we don't know what we want. And a perfect example is, I don't want any pain relief. Okay, and so women get into labor, becomes painful. They say to their birth coach, their other, and they say to their, this is really painful. And somebody says, would you like some pain relief? And they take pain relief. Then the person who's trying to support their choices is a little bit confused, and the birth plan then seems to go out the window. And the woman seems to be more relaxed, and that seems good. And then 6 months later, she's pissed off. And the person she gets most pissed off at is the person who was with her at the birth, usually her partner. Why didn't you insist I not have pain relief? Because it's not their job. It's your job, right? You have to be clear. Now, why are more women using pain relief? It's because when the natural birth movement got very global in the 1970s and 80s, they dismissed skills as being non-essential. So childbirth preparation, the first childbirth classes that ever existed, I took in 1970. They were all skills-based, Lamaze and Bradley, and in New Zealand, Grantley Dick Reed. So once skills were gone, the next group of childbirth classes morphed into information. So they talked about the pros and cons of all the medical interventions, because the assessments, the monitoring, and procedures then got lumped into one word called an intervention. And the natural birth movement was very clear that they were imposed on women and unnecessary. And they became known as the cascade of interventions. and skills weren't taught. So in the 60s and 70s, millions in the United States, multiple millions of birthing women like myself and fathers like my ex-husband, we used Lamaze and Bradley skills. Some okay, some not okay. It was all right. They were targeted to low risk women, so if we're high risk, we didn't feel inclined. If something changed, we stopped being inclined. The skills didn't adapt or adjust well, but it was a beginning. That was a beginning, right? And so when we lost my train of thought. Okay, so when we had no choices, we used skills. When you had choices, you didn't have skills. The labor and delivery nurses and obstetricians in the 60s to mid 70s saw multiple millions of women coping better. We reduced the concept of suffering in childbirth. Suffering in childbirth has always been the bigger issue. That doesn't mean there's a problem. It means women lack control when they're experiencing the natural occurring and physiological pain of labor contractions. It's just overwhelming. It hurts like a mother, and we don't have skills to cope. And nobody told us we could. And Lamaze and Bradley and Grantley Dick Reed were the first people who said, yes, you can, but they targeted low-risk women to achieve a pain-free labor, which great if you had one. Okay, so you need to understand that obstetricians and labor and delivery nurses in the United States saw multiple millions of women coping and reducing their suffering, and fathers really helping. By the time I gave birth in 1982, that was all gone. Nobody was being taught skills. We just had a birth plan. And fathers had been moved from being a coach to being a support, so they didn't know how to help us. So obstetricians and labor and delivery nurses, at least in the United States, stopped seeing 8 out of 10 skilled women and started going back to women suffering. And the medical profession, like any profession, midwifery profession is the same way, that we want to reduce suffering. If we are care providers, we don't want you to suffer, and we use the skills within our profession. So the medical profession knocked us out years ago. Then they gave us stuff like twilight sleep. Then they gave us just like over-the-counter oral pain-killing stuff that didn't really work. Then they got into spinals. Now they're into epidurals, right? Why did they do that? Because we demanded not to suffer. And when we no longer had skills and we suffered more and epidurals kept us awake and paying attention, we ran to them, right? The same way is we had cesareans, 4.5% cesarean rate. Everybody else labored. Then we didn't want to be left with an ugly scar on our belly because we were wearing bikinis. So the medical profession came up with a bikini cut. It became safer to do a cesarean. It became safer to have a vaginal birth after a cesarean. And they began to understand, and we began to say, well, my baby's a breech. I'm having twins. I don't want my baby to potentially have a problem, so I'm okay with having a cesarean. Safer for my baby if I have a cesarean. And so the cesarean rate has gone up, along with the fact that when we lack skills, we have more long first or second stages. We get more tired. When we get more tired, the medical profession wants to save us. Midwives, if they're at a home birth and our labor goes on for days, they get tired. We get tired. If they're obligated in their profession to give you continuity of care, they can't leave, which means everybody is tired, which means that if you go to the hospital then and you're looking overwhelmed, they want to save you or help you. So they're more likely to give you pain relief if everything looks okay in terms of the assessments, monitor, and procedures. And if not, then they suggest you have a cesarean because it's safer for the baby if you have a cesarean. And cesareans are safer than what they used to be. And then if you want to have a vaginal birth after a cesarean, you're more likely to be able to have one with the type of cesareans you have now. So birth professionals are professionals. You're going to them because you don't know what they know. Obstetricians are at the higher level. They can do things that GPs cannot do, that midwives cannot do. GPs can do things that midwives can't do. And then you have doulas that can't do any of those things. They're there to sort of help you. Where doulas are really important, and I'd like to say this just very out front, we need more natal doulas. Okay. Women don't need to have more support in labor. They just need fathers to go back to their role of being a coach, and they need to have skills. The fathers of my generation loved having skills. Skills weren't great, but they loved being able to do something, and we wanted them to do something. Why? A doula is not going to be in your life. That husband or mother or sister is going to be in your life and the baby's life. If you have skills to work through the activity of birthing your baby and they lack skills, you are shutting them out. If you both have skills together, then when you are finished with doing the activity of birth, which is still pregnancy, and your baby is out of your body, you have two skilled people who are going to move into parenting with more confidence. Whereas if you have neither skilled, right, and that's what's happening now, and that has been what's been happening since the natural birth movement got so loud and strong and global in the late 1970s. They dismissed skills. So skills and choices didn't grow together. So instead of seeing those multiple millions of women spread out into the next generation and now having more choices, women have choices, but they lack how to actualize some of their choices. If you don't want pain relief in labor, and you're saying, I don't want pain relief, then you damn well better have some skills to cope. It's as simple as that. Now, is the medical profession sort of titchy? You know, they want to do things. Yes, they want to do the assessments, monitoring procedures, because as modern people, we demand that. When I gave birth in 1970, there was no ultrasounds. There was no continual fetal monitoring. Nowadays, there are some Facebook groups out there that are very, very active, and women are going in and having all these assessments being done constantly, and they can rattle off all this medical information, but none of them are becoming skilled. And that's what's sad to us. So birth professionals, if you give this human being, who could be your mother, your father, your uncle, your aunt, your brother, your sister, your son, or your daughter. So anybody who's a birth professional is a human being, and they happen to be in a caring profession, and they have an interest in it. They also might be incredibly overwhelmed. Things might be going on in their personal life, or they may be working in a very busy location where there are lots of people giving birth at one time. So you need to understand these are human beings. And so you're going to them. You have, whether it's written or not, a partnership relationship with them. You have to own your partnership relationship. So one is you're giving them a birth plan, that's fine. But the other is you need to tell them something about how you're going to do the activity of birthing your baby. Because we as women are the only ones doing it. There's no birth professional can do it for us. Even if we're lying on the table getting our belly cut open, we're still lying on the table getting our belly cut open while somebody cuts our belly open, right? So we have to do this activity. And if we don't elevate it to a skilled activity, then we're missing out on a lot of things. One is we're missing out on our own dignity and capability. But when we look at birth professionals, if you were a birth professional, who would you like to work with? A bunch of unskilled people day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year? Or would you like to work with 8 out of 10 skilled families, where those families look like they're coping and managing, dealing with, handling, working through, staying on top of, and feeling in control? Who would you rather work with? I mean, this is a no-brainer. And so you have this relationship with your birth professional. And this is where our trust wants to bring forward a new concept. And it really was a concept from the 70s, which is skills. But those back then, it was directed to low-risk women to achieve a natural birth, pain-free labor without medical intervention. If those 3 obstetricians had been forward-thinking and said 100% of pregnant women will give birth, it's an activity each woman does with her baby, 100% guaranteed, and said every pregnant woman should learn skills so that she doesn't suffer rather than pain-free labor or no medical care or what? So if they just said, we want women to cope better, we would not be having this conversation, because my generation would have told my children, who would have told their children. And this is what we need to tell each other. It is normal and natural in pregnancy to self-learn birth and birth coaching skills. You can also learn information, but skills are what you're going to do or use. And it's natural and normal to do that in pregnancy. And then use those skills as you do the activity of birthing your baby, no matter where you birth, no matter who is present at your birth, no matter your circumstances, no matter your beliefs, no matter the choices you have or the choices you lack or the change of choices or what happens to or around you at your birth. In other words, this new idea, which could have happened in the 70s when it was an idea that was budding and then got chopped off at its knees by the natural birth movement, if it had come along with choices, you today would be making a skills-based birth plan along with your choice-based birth plan. And you would be asking your birth professional to put in your notes your choices and the skills you're learning. They don't have to learn the skills. At 24 weeks, start. I've learned breathing. But then have learned breathing. Don't find yourself in birth being told, oh, you're looking out of control. Why don't you use your breathing skills? Oh, I said I learned them, but I didn't. No, learn them, right? You can't practice to birth, so practice doing other stuff, right? 28 weeks, you may have learned relaxation, at least those two things. At 32 weeks, what other skills? Well, from a birthing better viewpoint, you can learn teamwork, you can learn touch, you can learn nonverbal and verbal communication, you can learn about how to keep your labor progressive, you can learn how to work through a non-laboring cesarean. We have lots of skills because hundreds of mothers and fathers developed lots of skills because we nitpicked the crap out of our births. We wanted more control. We didn't want to suffer, right? And things threw us off. So we developed a very highly developed skills-based method. But have them put that in your notes. That's your skills-based birth plan. When your birth unfolds, what happens? Well, your choices will either unfold the way you want. And out of the tens and thousands of women I've talked to for the past 50 years, maybe 5 have had a birth like they thought. All the rest of us said birth wasn't anything like we thought. So the reality is there's no way to know what your birth's going to be like, and babies don't come to plan. But it makes you feel better to make a birth plan than make a birth plan. But if you're doing lots of research about the pros and cons, put equal amount of time into learning the skills, because when the activity of birthing your baby unfolds, you have to do the activity. Nobody can do it for us. We are the only ones doing it. We can't stop for lunch and nobody can take it on for us. We have to do the activity. Doesn't it make common sense to become skilled? Yes, pregnancy and birth are physiological processes to our human body. So is being horny and having sex. Okay. Were you instantly skilled to be a good lover? That would have been remarkable. You had to learn the skills to be a good lover. Hunger. We're all hungry, right? Do we automatically know how to cook? Nah. Do we automatically know what's safe to put into our mouth? Well, if our children are any example, no, right? So we have to elevate birth to an activity. Why hasn't it been elevated to an activity? Well, throughout time and space, we weren't thinking globally, and there's no way to know what your birth's going to be like. So cultures tried to prevent problems, but just women got through birth, right? They just wanted a safe birth and okay, right? And then Lamaze, Bradley, and Grantley, Dick Reed developed skills, but they target them to low-risk women with the assumption they'd have a low-risk birth, right? Instead of everyone. So just things had to evolve. And then the natural birth movement ripped the skills away from us and said, no, it has nothing to do with skills. Women instinctively know how to birth. No, we don't. Birth will happen to us, and some women have great births. And they don't know why others have hard births. And women who have hard births don't know why women have great births. We know that more as birthing better, because if you have an object in you that comes down through and out fairly easily, you will have a fairly good progressive birth. if there are reasons that that object can't move down through and out your body easily, then your birth can probably be longer. There's no accounting for how much pain you have, so learn skills to cope with pain, because instinctively humans react to pain. They don't cope with pain, they just react. How do we react? Through our sympathetic nervous system, which is fright, flight, fight, or freeze. We can't do that in birth. We have to be counterintuitive, which means if we have skills, we can not like birth. It can be terribly painful. We can hate every single second of everything that everybody's doing to us around us, but we use our skills. How did the birth professionals feel about this? Well, from giving birth in 1970, they loved us. Because all the changes that occurred in the 80s by obstetricians, GPs, and the beginning of the midwifery movement came because we all coped and didn't suffer. So the medical profession was less intent on preventing the suffering and was focused more on reducing or preventing the risks. But they loved working with skilled families. They complimented us. They felt more relaxed. They negotiated with us better when we wanted to negotiate. When they see unskilled women, they just want to help and make certain that everybody gets through this experience. So here you are pregnant now. You're dealing with your birth professional. Become skilled. Elevate your partnership with them. Write a skills-based method. Pick and choose one of the skills-based methods. You don't have to choose Birthing Better. There are others, but make certain it's a method that will adapt and adjust and be sustainable when your birth unfolds, and if it unfolds in ways that aren't anticipated. And ask your birth professional to mark the skills in your notes. Ask your birth professional if they're going to attend you at the birth. If I look like I'm coping well and my other looks like they're helping me, damn it, praise me, praise us. We want your feedback. And if we look stressed and overwhelmed, please refer back to our notes and remind us to use the skills. Because sometimes we forget, or sometimes we think things have changed and it's not appropriate. We do not have a societal expectation. It's not a message that women pass on to each other or men pass on to each other, or birth professionals or birth worker or auxiliary people do not pass on. And that's what we're changing. It's up to you to make that change. I can stand here all I want and say this every single day, that we need a new concept. And that concept is an idea that giving birth is an activity that we do, and therefore it should become normal and natural to self-learn birth and birth coaching skills in pregnancy, and then use those skills as you work through the activity of birthing your baby, no matter what. That's the new message. You have to give that message. It's an easy message to give, but you need to give it to your friends and to your relatives, and you need to put it on social media. And if you're a birth worker, because our trust will work with any of you, we want to help you deliver the simple script. Hey, I'm a birth professional. You're a pregnant woman. I respect your choices. It's an activity you're going to do. Hopefully you can give them a handout of different skills-based methods. Pick one or more, and at 24 weeks, we're going to start putting the skills in your notes, just as we put your choices in there. And at your birth, if your choices unfold, yippee. If not, you can be involved in the decision making. But if it's an activity, and if you're coping well, we're going to praise you. And if you look overwhelmed, we're going to, first line of defense is to go back and say, use your skills, because it's your baby's birth. Work through the activity of birthing your baby. So what can you do for our trust? Well, lots of things. Subscribe to our YouTube channel. Go to our website, birthingbetter.org, and give us a donation. Help us to do this. Work with us. Partnership with us. How are we doing with the choice-based childbirth trend put in place in the 80s? We're more than a generation away. Are more women having the births they choose? No. Are more women happy? No. There is a massive increase in shame, blame, guilt, disappointment, anger, frustration, and emotional birth trauma. Are more fathers invested in the birth of their children? Hardly. Does this help families once the baby is born? Not at all. So having skilled mothers and fathers, adults who are skilled before they get pregnant, become skilled in pregnancy and use skills in birth, help them move out of birth and be ready to parent and do it with skills. So you are important. I can just blab on, but you need to make the change and you need to reach out to us. How can we work together to get the simple message, simple actions across using simple words? We know what has to be done. We've been sprouting this for 50 years. I, for 25 years before I immigrated to New Zealand, and 25 years in New Zealand. And people who are dedicated to the natural birth movement and people who have been dedicated to the midwifery model of care do not want to hear it. They honestly, deeply, fervently believe that women just know how to birth and that all they need to do is to be left alone to discover birth, and that birth workers should sit in the corner and knit. This has always been a faulty idea, not well worded, and the actions are not producing the results and the goals that they wanted, which was more natural births, pain-free labor with no medical interventions. They didn't care whether you suffered or not. They just believed that birth was natural and that whatever you experienced was a natural part of that natural experience. COVID brought me out because it's changed, and it may change for years. This is the opportunity for us to grow a skilled birthing population for 100% of pregnant women who will give birth 100% of the time. So join us today.